traveling at a very high rate of speed that headed towards Crown. That's the code word for the White House. The airplane hit the Pentagon. It's the one they thought was perhaps headed for the White House. And that's when I first recognized that not only was New York under attack, so was Washington.
You could actually feel a shake, and at that moment, I didn't know what had hit the Pentagon.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is in his office on the other side of the Pentagon when the third hijacked aircraft strikes at the heart of America's defense system.
The symbol of power for the United States of America had been attacked by some foreign element, really for the first time in our history.
We got planes down. We got planes down. Engine 101, did it crash over there at the Pentagon? Is that correct? Passport. The Pentagon. Heavy black smoke showing.
Rumsfeld leaves his Pentagon office to check on the situation.
As I went around the corner, you could see the flame and the smoke. People on the lawn who'd been injured. And it was a terrible crash site with bodies, pieces of metal spread all across the grass.
We knew about the attack. We didn't know much about the attack, but we were somewhat frustrated that we couldn't track down Secretary Rumsfeld. We were trying to reach Secretary Rumsfeld and hadn't been able to even connect.
Minutes after the attack, the country's top general arrives at the command center in the Pentagon.
When I arrived at the National Military Command Center, I'd been there a few minutes. I said, well, where's the secretary? And was quickly informed that he's out there essentially helping with taking care of those who survived and those who were injured.
I remember somebody had been put on a stretcher and needed to be moved away from the flame and the smoke. And so for a few minutes I was involved.
I'm saying, well, go get him. He needs to be here because in the end, the chain of command runs from our Commander-in-Chief, the President, to the Secretary of Defense, to our combatant commanders, and so we needed him.
Rumsfeld remains out of contact for almost 25 minutes.
I went back to my office and recognized that I had a responsibility, not just to know what happened at the Pentagon, but to begin to communicate with the President and the Vice President about what else might happen and how we ought to arrange ourselves to protect the American people.
At the Pentagon, the entire U.S. Navy Command Center has been wiped out. In less than an hour, 3 hijacked planes have struck at the heart of the country. No one knows how many more may be coming.
As soon as I'd heard the Pentagon had been hit, I told them to hook me up to the president. And by then, he was traveling from the school, headed for the airport. I told him that Washington was also under attack and strongly recommended that he not return, that we had to stay separate until we knew what was going on. There was a danger that a successful strike could, in effect, decapitate the government, take out the president and the vice president. And we needed to avoid that, and the best way to do that was if he would delay his return to Washington, which he agreed to do. He wasn't very happy about it, but he knew it was the right thing to do, and the Secret Service had also recommended that.
My best advice to the president was to get mobile and stay mobile in the air until we knew more and could figure this out.
Air Force One is preparing for an emergency takeoff with the president. The Secret Service is on maximum alert.
Looking out the window of the cockpit, you could see the president arrive, and he was all business. He came bounding up the steps.
We pull up to the stairs of Air Force One. The president's military aide was yelling, Everyone must get rescreened again for bombs. If you don't get rechecked, we're leaving you behind.
The bomb-sniffing dogs were there, going through all the bags on the apron.
The Secret Service agents stood over us yelling, "Move it, move it, move it," which is their code signal for move it.
We were pushing the staff and the press on in the back as quick as possible, moving them on.
We gathered up our gear, raced aboard. At that moment, we thought we were going back to Washington, D.C.
The concern at that point was, I'm a sitting duck sitting here on the ramp, but such an enormous aircraft just sitting on the ground. There was a lot of confusion, so we had to assume the president was a target. Taxiing over, we got word that there were people at the end of the runway.
They weren't sure if there was somebody out at the end of the runway with a Stinger missile or something and ready to shoot the plane down.
We just had to assume that these people were a threat. So instead of taxiing by them, we just took off in the opposite direction.
This takeoff was absolute chaos. The stewards were running around telling people, get in your seats, this is gonna be a steep takeoff. This is gonna be a rough one. We rocketed down that runway, and it reminded me of something out of a movie.
More like a rocket than a regular jetliner.
I'm standing, and we were climbing very quickly, and I'm realizing that I am going to go airborne. I had panic on my face, and I looked at the president, and he looked at me. He reached his arm out, as you would do for your 4-year-old, and he literally put his arm in front of me and was my seatbelt and kept me from going airborne.
We were in a new era already. And clear, our two oceans didn't protect us. We'd just been attacked. What was gonna happen next? You know, was President Bush himself gonna come under attack while we were there? I mean, no one knew what was gonna happen.
At the nation's Air Traffic Control Center in Herndon, Virginia, Ben Sliney, into his first day on the job, has to make a critical decision.
When I learned that American 77 had struck the Pentagon, I then ordered that all aircraft in the National Airspace System land at the nearest airport, regardless of their destination. At the time that the order was given, there were approximately 5,600 aircraft airborne.
You can see all these dots all over the screen. No matter where you look, I mean, they're dots, 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 dots over top of dots, and all of a sudden they start less dots.
It's got to be safer to land everyone than it is to continue this madness. We've got to get these aircraft out of the way, and whoever is left, we will know who is the bad guy, and that would have been a job for the military at that point.
The continuing attacks force America's decision makers to consider an unthinkable question.
Gee, if you have an airliner headed for the United States Capitol and it looks like it's going to run into the Capitol, do you or do you not shoot that airliner down?
The reality was we had to try to avoid another attack of the magnitude of the one on the Pentagon or the one on the World Trade Center.
Once an airliner had been hijacked, it became a weapon. And it's an enemy weapon. It may have Americans on board as passengers, but in fact, it's a direct threat.
As a shoot-down order is being discussed, a desperate message from United Flight 93 signals that a fourth aircraft has been hijacked.
When United 93 turned back towards the Washington area, we of course feared that it would be heading for the Capitol building, the White House.
You'd had attacks on the seat of economic power in New York. You'd had the attacks on the seat of military power, and it wouldn't be surprising if that was headed for the seat of political power.
I was surrounded by a SWAT team. They were yelling, "Get back." What they finally determined was to take me to the Secret Service building because it was blast-proof.
This is a combat zone. The Pentagon just blew up. We expect the White House to blow up.
The urgent priority for America's leaders at this moment is to secure the continuity of the nation's government.
We have a president, and if he's incapacitated or dies, the vice president takes over. And if he or she is incapacitated or dies, it moves to the Speaker of the House.
All of a sudden, two of my security guys grabbed me on both sides and said, "We're getting you out of here." I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, there's a fourth plane heading for the Capitol. You are the next person after the vice president in line for the presidency." The next thing I knew, I was on the helicopter, and we were flying to an undisclosed location.
In the White House bunker, the vice president is joined by his wife, Lynn, who's been evacuated by the Secret Service.
What an amazing thing to be in a front row seat and observing what was happening in that most central of places on that most awful of days.
Mrs. Cheney begins writing notes and records her personal memories of that day in the bunker.
There were cookies lined up in the center of the table on doilies. That was a little surreal, to come into the PIOC and have it arranged as though there's about to be a nice party. There was something sort of detached about it all. It was such an astonishing event that it was difficult to treat it as, you know, the really threatening and awful thing it was.
Aboard Air Force One, reporters flying with the president are unaware of the attack on the Pentagon. 70 minutes after the first tower was hit, they are only now able to see the scale of the disaster in New York.
Air Force One crew was trying to pipe to us a shaky picture from the streets of New York. That was our first glimpse of the magnitude of what they were looking at in New York. And as we watched, the first tower began to crumble and fall.
Mayor Giuliani and more than 20 members of his team have taken over a building just a block from the Twin Towers as an emergency base. The mayor is still desperately trying to contact the White House.
I held the phone. I was waiting for the vice president to come on. Then I saw the desk shaking. And I saw things moving on the desk. Like that. Like that.